I'm Rob Port from SayAnythingBlog.com, North Dakota's most popular political blog. I'm here with State Representative Kim Koppleman, who is one of the multitude of Republican candidates for the U.S. House this year. Of course, he'll be seeking the nomination at the NDGOP convention this weekend. Mr. Koppleman, thank you for your time.
Well, hello, Rob. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. The big question I'm asking all of the Republican candidates is, why are you running? I mean, what sets you apart from all the other options that the delegates will have at the convention this weekend in terms of becoming a candidate for the U.S. House? What's your edge?
Well, that's really a great question, Rob, and I'm very unusual, I think, because I'm running not in order to be something, but in order to do something. I really have no ambition to be in Congress, but I'm concerned about the future of our country. And because of that, I decided to get into this race after a fair amount of encouragement from friends and colleagues who have pointed out that they believe I'm the most qualified and experienced and also the best prepared, and they really see our country at a turning point, and so do I. And I think the decisions we make now and those we elect to represent us could well determine whether the nation we pass on to our children and grandchildren and the next generation is as free as the nation we've known, and it could be something very different.
When you talk about being the most experienced, most prepared, illuminate us a little bit on that.
Sure. Well, it's again kind of a paradox. I've never been a full-time government employee. I've never lived anywhere but North Dakota, so I'm unique in those ways. But at the same time, I'm the most experienced because I've served for 18 years in the North Dakota legislature. And I'm sure most of your listeners know that we in North Dakota are citizen legislators, which means that we are elected from among those we represent to go to the Capitol and represent them for a short period of time. We meet for about 3.5 or 4 months every other year. And then we go back to our job or our farm or our school classroom or whatever it is we do for a living, and we serve among those we represent under the laws we pass. And that's really what our founders intended for Congress. But, of course, it's a very different picture out there now. But so during those 18 years, I've also run a business. In fact, I've been in business for nearly 28 years. And been creating jobs and not just talking about it. And I realized that government doesn't create jobs, the president doesn't create jobs, the private sector does, small business does, and the free enterprise system allows that to happen. But we're becoming less free all the time in America, and that's why we need people that understand that to change the process in Washington. And actually, one of the things I've talked a lot about is moving power out of Washington back to the states and the people where it belongs. That's what our founding fathers intended. That's why the Constitution is crafted the way it is. That's why the 10th Amendment says what it says. But we've lost sight of that in a tragic way.
That's interesting. You're really the first candidate, and I've interviewed all of the House candidates now, and you're the first candidate who has brought up federalism directly.
Exactly.
Do you think that's something that gets overlooked?
Oh, I think it is. I think that there again, it gets back to wanting to be something versus wanting to do something. A friend of mine had lunch the other day with J.C. Watts. I don't know if you remember him. He was a congressman from Oklahoma, and a very good one, by the way, who term limited himself. And he said, when we went to Washington, we thought it was a cesspool. And when we got there, we realized it was really more like a jacuzzi. And that's the problem. Washington becomes that for a lot of people. I have no interest in living in Washington. I have no interest in being in Washington for any length of time. I have an interest in going there and doing something and bringing power back to the states and the people. And federalism is critical. It's a great question, Rob. I also had the privilege, in addition to being in various leadership roles in North Dakota, sponsoring landmark legislation on a number of issues, to be chairman of the Council of State Governments, which is all 3 branches of government in all 50 states. And that really taught me a couple things. One is that there's a whole lot more common sense in our state capitals in places like Bismarck, North Dakota, and Pierre, South Dakota, and even St. Paul, Minnesota once in a while, than there is in Washington, D.C. And secondly, that states can have real influence and real power if they work together. They haven't really done that before. We need to bring that kind of power to bear on Washington and hold Washington's feet to the fire to ensure that some common sense gets drilled back into that town inside the Beltway.
What would you say, the issues that everybody's talking about are obviously Obamacare, and I can go down the list and I can talk to every Republican candidate in the nation, and they'll all say they want to repeal Obamacare, they'll all say they want to balance the budget. Is there an issue out there that you think, and obviously we just talked about federalism, but is there an issue out there that you feel isn't getting a lot of attention?
There are probably several, but I think what's more important in this House race as we talk about this convention coming up this weekend, you're right. There aren't that many issues that separate us. When we've had 4 debates, and I know you've been at least 1 or 2 of them, And what's interesting about that is, as people ask questions on specific issues, there isn't a lot of difference in what the people say. But I believe we need more than people that will say the right things. I believe we need more than people that just will vote the right way or say they will. Most of them have never cast a vote in a legislature before. And we need more than people that will say they will fight the right fights. We need people that have a demonstrated track record of doing all of that and winning those fights. Because Washington can't wait. We need to change this country now. We need to get America back on track. And America isn't broken. Washington is broken. So I think that's an achievable task.
How would you contrast yourself in assuming, obviously we've still got to go through the nomination process this weekend,
Sure.
but assuming that you win the nomination, you're up against the Democrat nominee, Pam Gullison. How do you contrast with her in terms of ideology, policy, things like that?
Well, I'm very different. Pam Gullison has a very liberal record in her background, and I'm the only one that really does contrast in a real way, because Pam Gullison and I served side by side in the North Dakota House of Representatives in the Appropriations Committee for 4 years. So I'm the only candidate that you can look at a voting record side by side for 4 years and ask yourself the question, who is the fiscal conservative? Who is the liberal? Who talks about being independent and who really is conservative and representing the will of the people of North Dakota? Who talks conservative but votes with the liberal Democrat Party line, and who talks the talk as well as walking the walk and makes a difference for the people of the state. So I think that experience in the legislature is critical. I'm not saying that no one can ever go to Congress without being a legislator, but we are at such a critical time in our country that to run for the highest legislative body on earth with no experience casting a vote, particularly against someone like Pam Gullison, who has an extensive record and extensive experience as a legislator, I think is dangerous.
One of the issues that seems to have caused a lot of consternation about Representative Rick Berg's first term in office, and of course he's moving on and running for the Senate, but was his vote for the debt deal, which created, raised the debt ceiling, created the super committee, which we now know accomplished nothing. Realizing that we're talking about this with 2020 hindsight, would you have voted for that bill?
No.
That's a simple answer.
Simple question. No, I wouldn't have. And I think what's important is that the problem is not that Washington spends too little, or taxes too little rather. The problem is that Washington spends too much. And that's a huge issue. People say keep raising the debt ceiling. People say keep, adding revenue, and that's a polite word, a euphemism for taxes. That's not what's necessary. What's necessary is to balance the budget. And Washington has also proven that it will not vote to limit its own power. So when I talk about bringing power back to the states and the people where it belongs, again, I'm the only one in the race that's actually begun that process. We've passed a measure in North Dakota that will allow states the same power that Congress has to propose a single amendment to the Constitution without fear of a runaway convention. And it's called the Madison Amendment because that's what James Madison always believed the Constitution did in the first place. And the reason that's important is that when we reach a critical mass of states who are doing that, now we have the power to hold Washington's feet to the fire. And a good illustration is the Balanced Budget Amendment vote in Congress. The House passed it, they voted for it, but not by a significant enough majority. And it's languishing on Harry Reid's desk. The Senate will never take it up. And so Washington can send out press releases and say, oh, look at me, I voted for a balanced budget. Well, if the states band together and hold their feet to the fire, then Congress will put it forward. Then the budget will need to be balanced, and then we'll have some real fiscal responsibility in Washington.
That gets back to the federalism question again, because it seems to me like a lot of the government overspending, or even if we look at Obamacare, really ultimately those problems flow downhill and end up resting on the state's shoulders. So you're really talking about the states being more proactive in the federal government as opposed to sort of being, I guess, subservient to the federal government.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the way our nation began, Rob. That was the idea. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. We've lost sight of that. And so what happens now is the states become agents of the federal government far too often. And that's backwards. It's upside down, and we've got to change it. And again, I'm the only one that really has that kind of experience with my national involvement, chairing the Council of State Governments, and it's the only organization that includes all three branches of government in all 50 states. As a result of that, I know governors, I know attorneys general. I know judges. I know legislative leaders. I know secretaries of state. I can call people from all over the country and say, we've got an issue in Washington that needs your attention. And again, really hold Congress's feet to the fire. And something I didn't realize until relatively recently in talking with people in Washington who observe Congress very closely, they're scared to death of the states. And if the states ever get organized and mobilized and rise up and say enough is enough, and I think we're very close to that point in history, Washington will listen, and they won't have a choice.
The Ryan budget was obviously something, and again, from judging from Representative Rick Berg's first term in office, Democrats made a big issue out of the Ryan budget. Representative Ryan, as the chairman of the House Budget Committee, has another budget on the table. And again, we already see Pam Gullison, for instance, very, very critical of it already. Are Representative Ryan's efforts in terms of the budget something that you support?
You know, I haven't read the budget, to be honest with you. I've been pretty busy the last 4 months here, Rob, but I'll tell you what, I applaud his effort. And he is the only one that has come to the table that has laid a budget out and has said this is responsible, in a responsible way, has said this is what we need to do to help get our country back on track. Now, whether that formula is perfect, you know, seldom does a budget get introduced in Congress and pass the same way it's introduced. So there will be amendments, there will be horse trading, there will be discussion. That always happens. I know that from my work in the North Dakota legislature as well. But for Pete's sake, the Congress has not passed a budget in 3 years. It's not doing its job. And so we clearly need a budget, and it's very easy to sit back and be an armchair quarterback and criticize anything that comes up. You know, that's game playing. That's not getting the job done. That's not legislating. So the Democrats should be ashamed of themselves. They should come to the table and present their budget, and then let's talk. Let's figure out how we can get a meeting of the minds somehow to bring some fiscal responsibility to the federal government.
Representative Koppleman, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rob. Have a good day. Bye-bye.